To use the passive voice or to not use the passive voice? That is the question. And as an English teacher, a writer, and an editor, I deal with this problem every single day. But instead of listening to me today, we are going to turn to a legendary writer, Mr. David Foster Wallace. And if you guys don't already know, Write Conscious is the headquarters for David Foster Wallace content on YouTube. We already have a massive playlist of videos on him, and you can see that down below. And there will be hundreds more on him alone this year. So subscribe if you are interested. And now let's hear from Wallace on the passive voice. I mean, it's a similar thing. I know you've got a thing about the passive voice. The passive voice isn't always bad. If I've got a paragraph about a certain law and I say, the law was passed in 1967, that's totally appropriate. I don't want to pull the reader's attention on the group of legislators who passed the law. But you overuse the passive voice, you are distorting the normal order of the sentences. You are filling it up, often with prepositions or with forms of the verb to be, which is one of the ways that writing gets flabbed out. And you are dehumanizing the writing because there's no agent, right? So it immediately becomes more abstract. So the reader's eyes glaze over quickly. But this is what's very tricky about teaching. If you say to them, never use the passive voice, you are an idiot. Sometimes the passive voice is exactly what you want, but not all the time. And probably not more than 5% of sentences really need to be in the passive voice. I forget what that was an analogy with. Okay, so Wallace takes a very balanced approach, and he's talking to Brian Gardner here, who we'll be hearing from in a second. And Gardner recommends 5 to 15% of sentences have the passive voice in them. Also, because if you write way too actively, then it can be problematic. I have a friend who is a creative writing professor, has published multiple novels with Random House, and a couple months ago I sent him a manuscript, and it was all in a very active voice. It was infernal prose with lots of gerunds and verbal adjectives. It was going crazy. And when he read it and called me on the phone, he was like, Ian, I read this after a long day. It was 10 o'clock at night. I put my kids to bed and I sat down with a whiskey and I read this, and it was too much. And so, because it was way too active. And this guy is a published novelist, has a PhD from one of the top creative writing programs in the country. And even for him, it was a little bit too much because there are almost infinite levels of layering and contrast, not just within the story and with things like the villain and the heroes, but also with sentence structure and word structure and all these little minute things that people like David Foster Wallace and Cormac McCarthy really understand. And that's why it would take them 5, 10, 15 years to finish a book because they were adding all of that in. And it's our job as writers to entertain, to help rope people in and not make it too challenging. Even though something like Infinite Jest is a very challenging novel, Wallace still makes it fun and breezy after some of the more harder sections. And I know some of you guys are crazy, like you don't care about the fun at all. But if you just read like Derrida and Zizek and Heidegger and all the other really hard postmodernist theorists for months at a time without reading anything else, you start to go crazy. Maybe you start to act like some of those depressed university boys that are always moping around every humanities department. You don't want to be like them. And you don't want your audience to have to try too hard, especially while you are ascending in your journey as an author with your new skills. And so there has to be this great balance. And the passive voice isn't always bad. And this is especially true for fiction writing because the passive voice, there's a lot. Hemingway uses it a lot. Even Cormac McCarthy, David Foster Wallace, it slows things down. And as we were talking about, within a paragraph, within a sentence, you can make contrast with symbols. You can do contrast with sentence structure and words. There is stress and unstress. There is also kind of the pacing and the breath, which is controlled by punctuation and the use of active and inactive verbs. Because if you use a lot of active verbs and gerunds and verbal adjectives, you don't have to use punctuation at all. That's how Cormac McCarthy, for instance, can write a whole page without a period or even a comma. He just keeps it rolling with verbs that are active. And so now transitioning to talking about kind of the pitfalls of the passive voice and why you don't want to use it and when you should use it. And a good definition of the passive voice is that the subject of the clause doesn't perform the action of the verb. And Garner writes an example, the deadline was missed by the applicant. That's passive voice. Or you could just say the applicant missed the deadline. There was no reason in that sentence to use the was. There was no dramatic effect or contrast that was going on in that kind of declaration statement. And even worse, a lot of times people use the passive voice to eliminate the actor and eliminate clarity altogether because you could just say the deadline was missed. But who missed the deadline. And that's something that a lot of young writers and beginning writers forget, is that we as the reader need help. We need transitions. We need to know what's exactly going on. And you have to remind us multiple times, because you may not know you don't know what situation your reader's in. You don't, we all want your reader to be relaxed, have 8 hours of sleep, just had a cup of coffee and sitting down without any distractions. But most of the time, it's more like what my friend was experiencing. You've had a long day. Maybe you're not totally there, but you just want to read something good. So you don't need to be overburdened. You don't need to be searching for answers necessarily. So let's talk about the 3 reasons now why you shouldn't use the passive voice. And the first one is that it adds unnecessary words to the sentence that you're doing. And we heard Wallace say this, that when you use it, that you start to use more prepositions and more forms of the verb to be, and you start playing mental gymnastics to make sentences work. And the problem with that is that in sentences with active verbs, it almost becomes a skill to be able to put those sentences together and understand how to front load them with verbs and to activate them and create contrast. And there's like almost a path in the formula that works time and time again when you're using active verbs. But when you're using passive, and in that active word sequence, there is very little fluff and filler. But when you start using a lot of passive verbs, what starts to happen is you add filler to make the sentence actually work, because the passive voice is actually not aligned with how English should be written or spoken. We'll kind of get to that in a second, and it's kind of different than other Romance languages. And I kind of want to tell you guys, kind of want to hit you guys up with some good knowledge right now for your editing and your own writing. So I am an English teacher, I'm an editor, I'm a writer. My whole life is writing and reading. I mean, look at this channel. And so what I have done, and one of the best things that you can do for editing, in my humble opinion, is to get a multicolored pen and then color coordinate the 4 or 5 colors into a certain type of word. So for me, for instance, passive verbs, especially like was and stuff, I circle with red. Adverbs, I circle with green. Pronouns, I circle with black. Anyway, so I kind of circle all these different types of words. And so then if you look at a page of writing, for instance, and you have all these circles and you connect them together like a spider web, and you look at the page and it's this massive, beautiful spider web, then that means that writing most of the time is going to be very weak. And I know that is a blanket statement, but every single time you use an adverb or a pronoun or a passive verb, you made a deliberate decision to write something weaker, and it better be a good decision. And if you do that 30 times in 3 paragraphs, then there are massive problems there, and it obviously could be stronger unless it's a very exceptional circumstance. And so that's what I've always done with my own writing and with other people's writings. And it can absolutely change your life when you just make some of those switches and become aware and be like, okay, there's 30 of these circles on the page. Let's take that down to 15. And this is how one of my early professors who's published a bunch of books, his name is Lee Barnes. He helped me out because we used to have these in my creative writing program, these contests every single semester, and they had big cash prizes because I was at one of the better creative writing programs in the country, and they said so much money. And so they would offer a $3,000 first prize and a $1,000 second prize and like a couple $100 for third prize. And so I never won. It had been a couple semesters, and I was writing with my compatriots. Like I knew how good they were because it was, you end up knowing everybody because you're in classes with them, but you're also collaborating and working with them. And if you're on a fellowship or whatever, you have to get to know them for all the activities you're doing for the university. So I know all these people, and I'm like, I think I'm better. Like, I know I'm better than some of these people who are like winning this. And so my professor, he was like, okay, Ian, I need you to eliminate almost 80% of these adverbs, these passive verbs, all these different things, and let's see what happens. And lo and behold, I do that to my short story. Second place, $1,000. After that, I started getting published more in college journals and smaller journals that I was more or less getting rejected from most of the time. Same thing with like nonfiction academic essay stuff. Got my first paper approved for the Hemingway conference using that exact tactic. There was almost little to no passive verbs, pronouns, adverbs in that entire essay. And when I did use them in that kind of 5% zone, it was very deliberate. I would sit there and contemplate and be like, man, is this the one I want to use? This is the moment. Because when you're doing something, especially like nonfiction, you want as less filler as possible because you have to try and entertain people. And that's kind of one of the hacks to academic writing in general, is to make it more active, because a lot of people are very stuffy when it comes to academic writing. So if you reduce some of the difficult words and make it flow more like an active experience, and people obviously are going to enjoy it more. Okay, so the second reason is that if you don't add those extra words, so let's say you decide not to add extra words, well, what ends up happening is that you lose the clarity. Those extra words have to be there for clarity. So if you're using the passive voice but trying to keep it this minimalist flow going that doesn't seem too convoluted, it ends up not having the clarity that you want. We'll kind of discuss that more in a second. And third is that the passive voice is not the natural structure of the English language, which is actor, verb, object, in general. And the passive voice really subverts that. And it's like there is a slot in our brain, especially a language is its own living creature in my eyes. And it's like organic and it's really cool. And language works better most of the time if you're using it in a certain way. And the passive voice does not usually serve that purpose. And Gardner says, quote, "The impersonal passive voice is an opiate that cancels responsibility, hides identity, and numbs the reader." And it's absolutely true. Like, this is like my big fight. And that's kind of why, as a teacher, you have to make these big generalizations and do all this, because I'm sitting here, right? And I'm looking at all these student essays. I get 150 every single week mostly. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, I have 5 or 6 hours of grading. And all of it is mostly written in the passive voice. And it's like, oh my God, can I get some activity? Like maybe some of these ideas are good, but it just feels like an opiate. It feels like a slog. I'm like moving through it and I'm like, oh my God. And so, kind of saying like, hey, I give the same spiel. I'm like, guys, every single one has to be deliberate. If you're going to do this for the love of God, at least think about it a little bit. And I do the spider web stuff, and sometimes it works. And some people are just so ingrained with the passive voice and indoctrinated into that idea that they just don't change it. They don't even understand they're doing. And I actually think the reasoning is because their thinking is like slowed, that they're not interested in the ideas. Because if you have an idea that feels electric, you're going to state it actively most of the time. So if you don't care and you don't want to be there and you're writing an essay or doing something, it's not going to be what you want. So there are 3 different things that you should use the active voice for when you're talking about someone. If the person is unimportant, if the person is unknown to us, or if you're trying to actively hide this person's identity, then you should use the passive voice in those situations. And this does come in handy in fiction. The other time you should use the passive voice is when you want to load the punch at the end of a sentence. So every single sentence, not everyone, but a lot of sentences have a punch. And this is why I recommend putting a gerund, a word that ends in ing, or a verbal adjective, a word that ends in ed. And well, really that doesn't work, but really gerunds at the start of a sentence, because it activates the sentence and then it makes the reader, it kind of creates a curiosity gap and it makes the reader want to know what's going to happen in the rest of the sentence. And it doesn't always have to be the first word, but a gerund or an active verb in the first couple words is, I think, a very good practice if you're trying to convey something and keep kind of a flow moving. And so the passive voice, you can't really do that. You could do some weird sentence with like a modified gerund now, like gerund now with a passive verb, like running was my favorite thing to do, but that's a pretty weak sentence anyway. And the last reason you should use the passive voice is just when it sounds better. Like sometimes stylistically you have to be thinking about these things, and there may be a whole chapter. Like take this 5 to 20% as like just a guideline, because sometimes there are characters that are just a little bit slower, just a little bit more relaxed, and you need to respect that. And that's something that will grow on you as a writer when you realize that. So don't kind of take this with you or follow any specific rules, but just understand and think about when you're looking at your paper, if you circled everything, if you circled things that make it weaker, what would that page look like? And what was your purpose for doing that? And I've actually told a lot of people this and like try to help people in this regard, like some of my like clients or friends or whoever. And they'll look at it and they'll see this big spider web and like, well, that's what I meant. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I think that it just may be like a bit of stubbornness. They're like, it's adding style and like, saying was and were and all this stuff all the time really isn't adding too much to the story. And so what are your guys' thoughts on the passive voice? How do you think about it? How do you use it? Once again, if you guys are interested in more content, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.